In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how I created this vehicle design from these 3 random references. And I'm also going to be talking about how I overcome the struggles that I encountered when making this piece, talking about how expectations can sabotage your enjoyment and improvement in art. And be sure to watch until the end to see all the other awesome entries that the Jtuffdesigns community has done for the Jtuffdesignjam's art challenge. So for this art challenge, I decided to do something that's a little bit more out of my comfort zone, tackling a subject matter and also a genre that I normally don't do, and that is hard surface sci-fi. With my previous challenges, I've done something that's a little bit more fantastical and something related to architecture. I think it's good once in a while to push ourselves and try something that's a little bit out of our comfort zone, especially when it comes to casual challenges like this where the stakes are quite low. I definitely wouldn't recommend trying out something radically different than what you normally do when you're working with a client where there's an expectation of deadlines. But when you have something as casual and fun like a community challenge, I think this is a good time to do so. You can even see me trying out a different workflow than I normally do. Usually I just like to take my references and just do some sketches based off of that. But this time I tackled it by first drawing in a silhouette using a hard round brush. I'm not worrying about the details at all at this point. And I'm taking parts of the reference image that I like, that I find interesting, and decide to bash it and clip it into that silhouette. So what I'm trying to do with this process is trigger my brain into seeing things in the random and abstract mess, kind of like when you're looking up at the clouds and you're able to see maybe a dog in it or maybe a floating city up in the sky. But in this case, I'm trying to see whether those details give me inspiration for what the functional part could be, since I'm trying to approach this more from like a cool shape design perspective first and adding the functionality later on. And the base idea that I had for this challenge was to create a food delivery vehicle. And how I arrived at that idea in the first place was initially inspired by the second reference, which is a camera housing unit we came across during the art community that I run here in Sydney called Art Nest, and we decided to throw it in for the month's art challenge. Also in combination being inspired by the third reference, which looked like a delivery boy delivering newspapers. And the second reference in itself looked like a vehicle, so I thought, if I played around with the proportions a little bit more, added some more functionality, then maybe it could be an air bike. Maybe it could be a vehicle that the delivery boy uses. But instead of delivering newspapers, I decided to make the delivery boy deliver food. And that's just kind of a limitation or a common theme that I wanted to set for myself for these art challenges. With my initial iteration, I wasn't too happy with it since it didn't feel like it had that many functional elements with it. It just kind of looked like the equivalent of a chopper where it's made for speed. There wasn't a storage unit for the food. Neither would it be very good to face adverse weather conditions, because as you can imagine with the first design on the top left, if you're driving that at high speeds in the sky, the chances are you might even crash into a bird that's flying by, having all the debris just flying in your face. And maybe when it's raining, it'll be pelting at you. So I thought to myself, maybe I could draw inspiration from some other existing designs in the world, such as Vespas that have really tall windshields, which I initially did. But I thought I'm gonna do one better and do a vehicle design where it fully covers the top part. And of course, in order to put the food and make sure that it's well conditioned and kept warm for the customers, there's gonna be a box at the back and even a rack you can see to maybe strap on some extra items. And one of the issues with the early iterations as well was that what if the driver was going to park the vehicle? How would it actually land? And I had the suggestion from a friend to add in some landing gears. So you can see that I added some little feet, which is also inspired by the second reference where the feet of the camera housing are made to keep it upright. So I thought, why don't I increase the scale, make it feel a little bit more high-tech for it to perform essentially the same function for my vehicle. But in order to also make sure that the vehicle can turn and navigate itself through the air, these little legs are able to also jet out some propulsion in order to adjust its position and the main engine that propels it forward is going to be at the back, right underneath the delivery box. And at this point, I'm not really sure how to resolve the details. You can actually see that it's quite suggestive at this point, and it's okay. At this point of the design, I'm really not so focused on resolving everything at once. What I really care is mostly a cool silhouette and suggested functionality. I can always address it as I go further into my design. And you can see that I've also drawn in a character, and I'm trying to integrate some of his color palette into the design as well to create a sense of uniformity. But I also wasn't too happy with the color scheme, as it feels quite militaristic and not very food delivery friendly. So I decided to borrow some of the orange from the third reference, but it also reminds me of some existing food delivery services such as Just Eat, which you can see the reference. And I believe that orange and red, which you see even on McDonald's, is a very friendly and warm color. So I decided to take inspiration from that and slap on a nice delivery jacket on the driver. Initially, I thought about not changing the character design up too much, almost making it a 1-to-1 of the reference, because I thought that he had such cool vibes already. But of course, rather than just keeping it as it is, I wanted to push it a little bit more. And you guys might have even heard of like the 70-30 rule or 80-20 rule. And this is one way that you can apply it. The 70 representing the amount that you keep from the original design, and 30% is the change. So you can see the jacket and even the change of the technology level of the headphones from something a little bit more retro to something a little bit more sleek. But you can also see me trying to integrate the first reference, which I haven't talked about much at all. It's a rather odd piece of reference where it looks like rock pools with all these funky colors and patterns. And I thought about doing the vehicle flying through these rock formations, or at least having it in the backdrop, or integrating it somehow into the vehicle design. But I thought that that would feel a little bit too forced. So what I ended up doing was taking these patterns and even the colors from the first reference and integrating it as a motif for the clothing. And I also updated my vehicle design with the color palette to match the delivery jacket, but also integrating that funky neon green and yellow color as an energy source. So maybe rather than just running on typical fuel, maybe this vehicle runs on like Mountain Dew or gamer fuel. And you can see that evidently in the pipes that's flowing through the vehicle, but also in the headlights as well. And it might not be the most practical color, and in fact, maybe seeing neon green lights heading towards you from the sky or lighting up the dark alley as you're waiting for your delivery might not be the most reassuring color to have, but you can't argue that it's probably going to be an iconic part maybe of this delivery service. And right now you can see me refining those details, refining the forms before I go into the painting. You can see me adding in the perspective grid, and all of the forms that are previously wonky, this is the time to tighten it up and also resolve some of the functionality. So I've actually taken a little bit more time to gather extra references, and you can see me slapping some of those in right now. And this is where I struggle quite a bit, because as I mentioned, I'm not as familiar when it comes to sci-fi. So I'm not able to jazz up and come up with some of these details as easily as I normally would with, let's just say, architecture or fantastical type of design languages. And on top of that, having to draw those complicated forms in perspective, so designing on top of doing perspective and fundamentals on it, I really was biting off more than I could chew. And in fact, I even thought to myself, why didn't I just do this in 3D in the first place, similarly to how I did it for all my previous art challenges? But as I mentioned, I thought that I would change it up, because I get bored quite easily. I don't really like doing the same subject matter, the same workflow a lot. If you follow me on my Instagram, you'll see that I have different phases basically. I have a painter's phase, I might have a line work phase, and I might have like maybe doing a concept art phase versus illustration phase. But I like to do this to keep myself entertained basically and keep art fresh. So I decided to challenge myself by doing hard perspective, which really throws me back to the old FCD days. And I can't remember the last time that I've done a project where I really had to calculate the perspective by hand. And of course, if you are working with a client, you probably want to focus on efficiency, and probably this isn't the best use of your time and also probably not the best time to be challenging yourself with something that's newer for you, as having that added pressure of deadline can really make it so much more stressful, as if designing isn't stressful enough as it is. So you can see me trying to implement a few different strategies here. You can see that I even went to Blender and used a little bit of help trying to create my own reference. And sometimes that's a difficult part, right? Is that you can't find the ideal reference. So if you have the ability to create your own, whether it's taking pictures of something that exists in real life, you can even slap together a Pringles can with, some extra cardboard elements on it in order to get the forms if you don't know how to use 3D and you're feeling quite arts and craftsy. Or you can hop into Blender, for example, to create your own reference. Similar to how James Gurney decided to create his own sets and models for his Dinotopia scenes, which is really cool. But I honestly was struggling quite a bit, making sure that the functionality made sense, but also making sure that the forms read and look proper. And I'm used to mostly doing chunky shapes as well. So you can see me even going to the character a little bit just to take a little bit of a break. And I feel like sometimes I'm still quite stubborn in terms of not having enough references. Even though one of the advice that I give to people a lot, especially beginners, is to use reference, sometimes I can't help but feel a little bit complacent when it comes to it, because maybe it's a little bit of hubris or a little bit of cockiness, feeling like, I've got the experience, I'm sure I can figure it out. And sometimes there are going to be moments where not using as much reference when you're more experienced can actually be liberating, because you're going to be surprised at sometimes what you're going to be able to come up with from the existing visual library. And sometimes that unexpected or even something that's a little bit more removed from reality could result in something more unique. So I do think that there are some moments where using less reference or just trusting your instinct a bit is good. But that's not what I recommend for beginners or with a subject matter that you're not as familiar with. Because most of the time, you're just going to end up with something that doesn't look so resolved, that looks immature, and it just looks plain weird or off or non-functional. So this piece definitely was a good reminder for me that I'm not above using reference. And in fact, if I'm feeling really stuck, it'll be a good idea for me to take a step back, actually ask myself, okay, what information and resources do I actually need to help me achieve and solve these problems? Because essentially that's what concept design is. It's problem solving. Sometimes that problem is a functional aspect that you need to solve. So in this case, it's the landing gear. How is the landing gear able to turn? Where is the food stored in this design? It might even be a matter of perspective as well. So in this case, bringing up the perspective grid and just taking the time to calculate it, which I was also trying to rush through. So that didn't help things at all. Also a matter of how I render the materials and the lighting as well. And because most of the time I do fantastical architecture, I don't really get the opportunity to do materials that are a little bit more shiny and chromy and reflective. And I don't think it really helped with the workflow that I approached this with too. I was using a brush that was a little bit more scratchy, and just by default, the kind of results that I'm getting makes it look very grungy and gritty. And also I didn't make any individual masks for the elements, such as maybe the headlights, maybe the window panes, or maybe even the individual landing gears as well. And as a result, all of the edges and the silhouette felt very jagged as well. So if I had to look back at this and improve upon my workflow, it would have definitely been to separate the elements into different masks. It doesn't have to be so tiny to the point that every little part has to be on its own layer, because that could be a pain in itself. But at the very least, the major ones, like I said, maybe the headlamps, maybe the rear view mirror, maybe the bumper, maybe also the landing gear and the delivery box, so that I don't have to constantly lasso to make a clean selection. Because I didn't establish this workflow early on and I wasn't really sure what kind of finish I wanted, I was fluctuating a bit. I wanted it to be painterly, I wanted it to look clean as well. But overall, it was my lack of experience with this subject matter and these kinds of materials, and even my lack of visual library, that made this piece extra challenging. And because it's fast forwarded and there's lots of cuts here, it might seem like everything went quite smoothly. But I promise you, when I was working on it, I was getting pretty frustrated, and what was supposed to be a fun piece quickly became something that was stressful. And look, it's not to say that every piece that you do has to be fun, but I do believe it still comes down to, well, what is it that you're trying to get out of it? If this is a piece that you're meant to challenge yourself, then of course, you should embrace some setbacks. And when the piece doesn't go well, there's just part of the process. If you're pushing yourself hard enough, you're trying something new, then of course it's inevitable that you're going to make some mistakes and it's not going to turn out how you want it to, at least not in the first go, right? And that's something that I often find difficult to reconcile with myself. Is it, do I want this to be relaxing? Do I want to get this done quickly? Or do I want to use this as an opportunity to go out of my comfort zone, struggle a bit, and learn something new? And quite often, I just want to do everything. So that's probably, once again, one of my toxic traits. And I think you guys are getting more and more familiar with my toxic traits with every video. But I think it's important to share this with you guys as well, that, and it often can be quite discouraging when you don't do as well as you want. And even this far into my career and spending quite a long time in the industry and also just doing art throughout my life, I think it's still common for me. And in fact, every once in a while, I can't help but feel a little bit discouraged and even feeling like, well, is this it? Is this going to be the piece that I struggle with so much that my progression and my ceiling ends here? However, rather than feeling like there's something inherently wrong with you and not actually sorting through the knot of negative emotions with you and just coming to a conclusion that, oh, you're just bad, well, why not actually break down the things that you're struggling with and figure out a plan or a strategy to overcome them? So in this case, I was struggling with the materials, I was struggling with the perspective, I was struggling with the functionality. And a lot of the times it can just be solved with more references and also just more practice. If you can afford to, maybe take a step back, break down all of these individual things that you need to work on and tackle them one by one, and tackle them with simpler chunks as well. So rather than rendering a whole vehicle, I could have just taken a step back and done a few smaller material studies. Maybe I could have done it on spheres, cylinders, cubes. And when it came to a functionality, I could have actually just taken a step back and do just some studies where I take a few images from Pinterest of certain designs and just copy them and get a better understanding of it, of how it works, watch some documentaries maybe if it's available. And when it came to a perspective, you can see that I actually took a step back, modeled it out in 3D, but also just being a little bit more patient. Sometimes the issue isn't that you don't know enough, but it's just that you're not patient enough. It's not uncommon even for me to rush through things as well now and do things mindlessly too. But a lot of the times, the reason why you don't like a piece or you're feeling frustrated with it is because of problems that can be broken down and can be solved. Most of the time, especially when you're starting off, it's hard not to think about it as like, oh, maybe I'm just not talented enough. And maybe it's the fault of how the discourse around art and how learning art has largely felt like it was all about talent. But I promise you guys, most of the time it's just due to a lack of knowledge or a lack of practice, or maybe the scope of what you're trying to do is too big right now. And it's time to tone it back. And one of the things that's highly underrated too is to just take a break. When you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, the solution isn't to keep on banging your head against the wall until the wall breaks. Sometimes there's moments to do that, but most of the time, just take a step back. And I think there's a reason why some people find their best ideas when they're in the shower, when they're out for a walk, and basically spending time away from the problem. And one of the analogies that I have about it is that it's harder for you to have this wider picture and a little bit more of a detached and objective view of things if you're so zoomed in and up close with the problem. So in the same way that the more time you spend in a piece, you can imagine yourself walking deeper and deeper into a cave. It takes almost the same amount of time for you to kind of detach from it in order to actually see things from a different perspective and even having like different emotions and thoughts about it as well. Like I said, you don't always have the opportunity and of course the time to do so, but whenever you can, I highly suggest you do. Some of the solutions and even my best ideas come to me when I am taking a break, and I can't emphasize that enough, guys. I really do believe that sometimes taking a break is seen as a lack of productivity, but I see it more as essential as a process to productivity. In the same way when you go to the gym, when you're resting after a tough workout, it's not that you're lazing about, you just need time for your muscles to recover and actually grow. And it's the same thing too when it comes to art. And in fact, I actually feel like there's a lot of things that I try to implement into my art approach that I've learned from working out or doing sports as well. So I think it's quite fascinating in that way. But like I said, it's quite often the case where art is talked about as a talent you have or you just don't have. And going back to the analogy of gyms, imagine if you're just starting out, you've never worked out, you've never done a certain exercise before, and you're expecting to lift the biggest weight or do the most difficult workouts, like you're gonna do handstand push-ups or do a deadlift or like, twice your body weight without any prior experience. If someone tried to do that, you'll probably be like, well, don't, that's pretty crazy. And in fact, it's unreasonable for you to think that you can. And it's not to say that you won't eventually be able to do it, just that you need to work your way up. Start with lighter weights, get your body acclimatized. And I think you can take the same approach when it comes to art, rather than jumping in unreasonably thinking that if you haven't done this subject matter or you've never really done art to be able to do an amazing world building project of a certain scale and be able to do it easily, then I think that's really unreasonable. But somehow we believe that that's the expectation and we feel really bad about not being able to do so. It's just that you haven't put in the work to be able to do it. But I promise you, if you break things down, tackle it in a way, going back to the gym analogy, doing simple enough workouts, work on it consistently, break it down to simpler exercises, and you're serious about your rest, and all of that, and you give your body and mind the time to rest as well, then I promise you guys that eventually you're going to get to a point where you can do it. And this is something that I really struggled with in the past. Even when I was in FCD and up until recently in my life, I always felt like I was too overly ambitious and my ambitions were far bigger than my skill. And because I kept on trying to go beyond my means, far beyond my means, I would often get frustrated and then give up. But it's not to say you shouldn't challenge yourself, but it's all about getting yourself into that optimum stage where it's difficult enough that it's challenging and fun and engaging, but not so easy to the point that it's boring. This comes with a bit of experience, and it's okay sometimes to even do some pieces where it's so challenging that you may be like, all right, I'm gonna just give up on this piece, but at least you know where your limitations are. And rather than, once again, coming to a conclusion that, oh, I suck, why not try to take something positive out of it and just realize that what your weaknesses are, what you need to work on, and then formulate a plan around it to actually tackle it. And I promise you that if you guys approach art from this more like analytical and also a little bit more of a problem solving standpoint, so just as design is problem solving, the way that you approach solving problems and weaknesses and limitations in your art in the same way, then I promise you guys that eventually you will be able to do the kinds of pieces that match your ambition. And I know that this has been a little bit more of a mindset related talk rather than something that's a little bit more to do with the technique side of things. But I think it's as important, if not just as important, even more important, because most of the time I actually find that people give up because of the mental side of things rather than just from how difficult a particular technique is. And here is the final result of the Goober bike, or the Goob 3R bike. It's equipped with the latest eco-friendly technology. This bike runs on gamer fuel. Extra spacious air-conditioned food storage and high top speed allows for maximum efficiency in delivery. And here you have top Uber Eats driver Chase Swift, who's using this job as a way to fund his pro gamer ambitions. And you can see how he transfers his work ethic from his pro gaming pursuits into his delivery services, gathering a rating of 4.9 stars out of hundreds and even thousands of reviews. And you can be sure that your food will arrive hot with him. And I'm very happy with how it ended up, guys. I still think I can do better with the materials, but considering that it's out of my comfort zone and I had a suboptimal setup when it comes to the workflow, I think it looks pretty good. And I hope that you guys also got something out of seeing how I approach the workflow, how I decided to solve the problems, and even having a little bit of insight on how I approach my mindset when it comes to dealing with struggles and even expectations and how to overcome that. And of course, a Jtuffdesignjam wouldn't be complete without the awesome entries from the rest of the community. So I'm proud to present you guys all of the other entries that they have done as well. And I hope you guys are inspired to try this challenge out for yourself as well. And if you are, you can find a link to it and details in the description box below. And I'd love to see what you guys come up with for the next one. So until next time, guys, take care. And as always, stay stretchy.